Hello and welcome to this video. And the man I am interviewing today needs absolutely no introduction. Good afternoon, Monsieur Jean-Luc Ponty.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Thank you. I'm okay, thank you.
It's wonderful to talk to you. I've been trying to think of some questions for you, but you've done so much. You've worked with so many of my absolute idols over the years, so I think I'm just going to start right now and ask you what you're doing at this moment.
At this moment, I'm talking with Andy, doing an interview. Um, I guess what I'm doing is I am doing a lot of things actually. My mind is spinning. I didn't expect, I was expecting to have a quiet senior years, but it's almost the opposite. So anyway, I'm working on reissuing past albums of my catalog. My catalog, the one I produced and owns, started in the early 2000s. So I have a few albums and reissuing. That takes my time. And also I have quite a collection of electric violins. And there are some I don't use anymore. So there's an auction sale of some of my violins, which took me also a lot of work. I didn't expect it, but I had to write stories about each instrument. At the same time, it's nice to revisit the past and my connection to these instruments. So anyway, I'm very busy.
Yes, you said you seemed quite busy when I was trying to contact you, and it's wonderful that you're revisiting your back catalogue. How far are you going back? Are we going to see Jazz Long Player reissued, the very
Not,
first one?
not that far back. No, that was my God, 1964, right? I
60
was
years ago.
21. I was 21 years ago. Yeah, 21 years old. So anyway, no, there are a few albums which recorded in the 80s for Atlantic Records, but they own the masters in the USA and Canada only. And my company controls these recordings in the world outside of USA and Canada. So like individual choice, open mind, no absolute time. And so those are reissued already. But then in the years 2000, I started my own catalog. And so Life Enigma has been re-released already. Now I'm working on the next one, which is the Atacama Experience. And I must say, I'm happy with the compositions on these two albums. So it's a pleasure to rework on those.
How much do you think composition is important to an instrumentalist? Do you see yourself as a violinist or composer or both? What would you see yourself as first?
I must say that now I see myself as both. I have been focusing again on my violin playing in these late years, but and when I started playing jazz, I was not composing much. I was composing, but what I was composing did not really fit the bebop style or the jazz style in general. So that's why I waited until I could have my own band. And I also developed a concept of how to make a synthesis of my musical experiences, classical music, jazz, and rock. And once I started touring and recording with my own band, starting in 1975 in Los Angeles. Then I felt more as a composer than a violinist, because I was really focused on the compositions. I was using my playing like the other guys. My goal was not to put the focus on me as a violin player. In those days, I was really feeling more as a composer and band leader than a violinist. I mean, of course, I felt also like a violinist, but again, this was secondary. And when we can hear it on my albums and on tours as well, I didn't play longer solos than the other guys in the band, like the guitar player or bass or drums or keyboards. You know, I was using myself as an equal band member as the other guys.
I think it's something that's underestimated with a lot of those sort of classic jazz rock musicians that really did well. I think it was because they wrote strong compositions, and you without a doubt wrote very, very strong compositions. Like you said, starting from 1975, but going back to the earlier albums, it's a lot more about violin playing. I went and revisited your very first album, and I found it very interesting. And one of the things I would love to ask you about is you had a classical training at a conservatoire that had trained people like Messiaen and Ravel and Darius Milhaud. It's an incredible place. So, what was that training like? Was there any jazz there at all, or was it strict classicals training?
Can you repeat the end of your question?
When you were at the conservatoire when you were young, was there any jazz there, or was it a strict classical training?
It was very strict classical training to a point where they were disregarding jazz as really not an important style of music. And in fact, if they heard that you were playing jazz, you could be fired from the conservatoire. The reason is it was not expensive, you know, it was funded by the state, and therefore they could only admit a small number of students, because when it's not like another matter, music, you have to play your instrument and the teacher has to listen each student. So we were, I think, 5 or 6 per class. And therefore, it was a privilege in their mind, and even for us, and for me, to be admitted. You had to pass an exam, and once you were admitted, it was considered a privilege to be, you know, studying at the conservatoire. So if they heard you were doing other things on the side, like it's like for them in their mind, it's like you were not really being serious at studying your instrument. And it's different now. There is a jazz class, and for all instruments, and arranging, composing, totally different.
So if it was that strict, why did you move across to jazz as a genre, and how did that happen?
Well, they were, I met some guys who were not, they were students in another university, some electronics, I forgot what it was, but, and they had a jazz band, you know, amateurs, and they were Benny Goodman style, and they were looking for a clarinet player. So they asked me if I knew a clarinetist studying at the conservatoire who could play jazz as well. And I said, no, I don't know any. But I had learned clarinet as a third instrument. And so I thought, hey, I'm going to play at parties once in a while, meet girls, and that's cool. I had never played jazz before, but so I volunteered to go play with them, and they realized I knew nothing about jazz. And but I could improvise on the spot. That was a revelation to me. I had, because they were playing a tune and said, do you know this tune? You know, and so I was trying to fake it. I said, how does it go? And then I started playing on it. So, you know, after 3 tries, they understood. They say, okay, you know nothing about jazz, but you have a good ear, you can improvise. So we hire you. So that's how I learned the principle of jazz. You play the melody and then you go back to the top and improvise on the chord changes. And that's how I started, and it was just for fun, you know, once a month, I would go play clarinet and on a Saturday evening, you know, for their party. And on Monday morning, I would be back with my violin playing Mozart. And I did not see a link with the violin at all. And I didn't want to, in fact, because I thought it would really, it could not damage, but change my technique. Excuse me a second, I have to shut the door.
Yeah.
So, but one day I went to a jazz concert and after a classical gig, and all I had was my violin. And I felt so moved by the music that I wanted to jam with them. By then I had a knowledge of what was jazz about, but I had never played jazz on violin. And it was a revelation to me, and the audience liked it. They immediately stopped dancing and they were listening, and it was a big success. So that's how I thought that, wow, that's an opportunity maybe. I realized it was possible to play jazz on violin. At the time, I had not heard of any jazz violinist, not even Stefan Grappelli, because he was at a low in his career. But after discovering I could play jazz on violin, then I went to a record store and found Grappelli, Stuff Smith, and a few, and so I started listening. And that's how it created that that desire to dedicate my life to jazz on violin.
Well, I don't want to embarrass you too much with my gushing comments, but I think you and Stefan are obviously the 2 greatest jazz violinists of all time. And the thing I've always found fascinating with you, because I really think that Stefan Grappelli was not just a great jazz violinist, he's one of the most important jazz musicians of the 20th century, because he bust jazz out of the US, for example, created a different style, and he brings in a European influence. And so for you to come along and actually have a different approach and sound and actually break the mold of the great Frenchman, yourself being French, is an incredible thing, especially at such a young age. And so this is why I went back to your early album, your first album. And one of the things I noticed on it, there's very little use of vibrato in your soloing. Was that conscious to try and be different to Stefan's very rhapsodic, which is interesting with your classical training? That's almost like going against, isn't it, that approach?
Yes. Well, in my mind, it was not a decision to be different from Grappelli, but it was natural for me to adapt the violin to the style of jazz I was playing at the time. And also because I started playing on a wind instrument, on clarinet, so I kind of transferred the concept to the violin. But really what happened is I was listening to modern jazz, to Miles Davis, to John Coltrane, and Sonny Rollins, and Clifford Brown, and Bill Evans. And the passionate European vibrato, didn't work for that music. And in fact, to a point where modern jazz musicians felt that violin was not appropriate to play modern jazz at all. And it was kind of a handicap even to be a violinist trying to play modern jazz. When I would arrive in a jazz club and would ask to jam with the band, they would look at me like, well, they were not sure they would accept. And then once they heard me, then they were convinced. So they were accepted me in the circle of modern jazz musicians, and that's what I felt. The vibrato had to be changed. And at the beginning, I disregarded the vibrato completely, like Coltrane, this straight sound. And so the expression was in the intensity of the sound, as opposed to that vibrato, that romantic.
What was your approach to the harmonic vocabulary? Were you thinking in terms of modality or free jazz? Where was that coming from? Because there's a difference in your harmonic vocabulary, I think, as well.
Yes, well, that came from the fact that's why I became passionate for jazz once I discovered bebop and post-bop, because they were obviously using harmonies from Debussy and Ravel, and I love these harmonies. And also, it is important to know that piano was my second instrument, and it's thanks to piano that I would understand the harmonies, and therefore my concept when I was playing jazz on violin was not really to focus on the instrument on its own and what a violin can do, but it was really the notes I could choose on each chord, regardless of the instrument I played.
So it's very interesting talking to you. So I suddenly realise you're thinking of jazz on clarinet and you're thinking of it as on piano. And so you're not necessarily thinking of the stylistic approach of the violin that existed at that time. You're thinking in terms of the music. And I think that what you've said about Coltrane and Miles is his big sound innovation is to play straight, no vibrato, completely against Louis Armstrong before. It's a very interesting thing. But the other thing I'd like to ask you about, which I think hasn't been discussed that much, and even I have made this mistake. I've done a number of videos looking at the early pioneers of jazz rock, and you were there very early on playing jazz rock. And one of the interesting things for me was going back to the Violin Summit album that you did with Stuff Smith and Stefan Grappelli. That opening track's one of your compositions, isn't it? And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a jazz rock track, isn't it? And not only are you playing jazz rock, but it's almost like Stefan's playing jazz rock as well. What was that? What do you remember of that session? It's an incredible session. I think what gets discussed is the fact that all these incredible violinists came together, but actually listen to the music. It was really ahead of its time. With Stuff Smith and I mean the two, like these guys go back to the 1920s almost. It's incredible.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
Incredible stuff.
I felt like a kid, I was in my 20s, and it was great for me to be invited with this legendary jazz violinist. Stuff Smith was the one who I felt the closest to in concept, because he was the first to also adapt the violin to jazz, like punching the instrument like the same attack as you would have with a horn or a trumpet. And he was my favorite jazz violinist. In fact, once I discovered his playing, so it was fantastic. We did play together a concert in Paris. And I went to listen to him, and he liked my playing as well, which was very encouraging. So the Violin Summit concert, which was recorded live, right? The album is a live recording of that show. So I was the young guy who, I had a different style from the others who were more in the swing style, and but yes, they accepted to play my composition. It was
Which is quite modal, isn't it? Your composition.
sorry.
It's quite modal, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. So that it is incredible to listen to Stefan negotiate the modality, because those guys that's a new concept. And actually, if you check him playing some jazz standards after that album, he's playing a lot more modally. He'll get into two chords and just and play over the top of it in that way. It's absolutely incredible. And the other thing I noted is you did have a little bit of vibrato on that album. There's a little bit of you come together a little bit. It's a wonderful album. I think. I mean, it's gone down in history of all these great violinists. But if you actually sit down and listen to it, I didn't even know it was live. I've heard it so many times.
Yes, it was live, and PS, the record label, wanted us to go into a recording studio after the concert. They felt it would be probably better quality recording, but we were so tired. Not so much me, I was the youngest guy, but it was very late, after a concert being in the studio for hours. And in the end, the live version was much better than the studio version. So it's interesting testimony of
Yes,
how each violin is played at the time.
Yeah. Is this the point when did you go to the US after that album? Is that right? 67, 68. That was 60.
Right. I went to the States a year later, probably. I think I was invited to go to the Monterey Jazz Festival by John Lewis, pianist and composer and co-founder of the Modern Jazz Quartet, for those who don't know. And he discovered my playing in Paris. They were touring, and he was a musical director of the Monterey Jazz Festival in those days. So he invited, in fact, he wanted to reproduce the Violin Summit. And but Stefan Grappelli couldn't make it, Stuff Smith neither. So it's only me and Sven Asmussen who went. So and then we ended playing, I ended playing with John Lewis, with the Modern Jazz Quartet. And so anyway, it was my very first time in the States. But then there were in the audience was Richard Bach, who was founder, producer of the jazz label Pacific Jazz, and then World Pacific, because he was already open. He was ahead of his time, open to music from around the world. He had gone to India, and he recorded Ravi Shankar, and later on Subramaniam. So that's why his label was called World Pacific. And so he heard me play at that festival and offered me to sign a deal with his label, which I did. So it was the first contract I had with an American label. And I had to go to Los Angeles in 1969, 2 years later, to spend quite a good part of the year recording for that label. So
would this be the Electric Connection album in '69?
yeah, that's
And
it.
that's, I mean, if you're looking at jazz rock albums in 1969, In a Silent Way, maybe, Hot Rats, Frank Zappa, not yet record. You're right. What was pushing you to play jazz rock? You were right on the cutting edge of fusing these two styles. So what sort of rock music were you into?
Well, because I started to, I discovered the Beatles, I discovered, what's his name? Oh, God. Oh, James Brown. And me and my fellow musicians of my generation, you know, we started to discover these different rhythms. And I met guys from, God, my memory, this British band that was jazz rock to ahead of its time.
Like Soft Machine, perhaps?
Yes, excuse me. While playing in London, I met the guys from Soft Machine, and in fact, I also was playing and working with Wolfgang Downer in Germany, who had started to incorporate elements of rock and R&B as well. And in fact, we did a tour in Germany. I did a tour with Wolfgang Downer on keyboards, and he was starting to play synthesizers, and Robert Wyatt on drums from Soft Machine.
Wow.
So I had gotten into this concept of jazz rock before going to the States, but then it went on in 1969 because there I met George Duke, who was at the time mostly a jazz piano player, but his background was from gospel and R&B, and so we played some of these rhythms with he was starting to play an electric piano at Fender Rhodes as well. And so I plugged in a bigger amp, and that's when we started to write our own material using these rhythms, you know, rock or R&B. And that started to be quite a difference with traditional jazz, because I must say that at the time, post-bop and all that was becoming very intellectual. And I got into it for a while, but after a while it was too much, not spontaneous enough, not as much emotion and this rhythm that make you move, you know. So that's why jazz rock, the concept of doing a synthesis of different styles of music appealed to me and gave me a chance to use my musical background in classical music as well, because I was missing these moods with long, you know, strings, very, very long sustained notes that create more of a poetic mood. And so I was able to do that with synthesizers. And I had access to these synthesizers myself, playing piano. I could play keyboard because the first ones were synthesizers were with keyboards. And that's how I found these sounds. And somehow, since I could not afford a symphony orchestra, I used these synthesizers to create these sounds, these moods, and sections also get out of the traditional jazz format, which was to write short songs like 32 bars, A, B, A, you know, there's a melody, then a bridge, then again. There, I let go, like with my, again, classical experience to write long pieces, symphony type or concerto, which would move into different sections. And the solo section for improvisation could be a different one as well, not necessarily based on the first or second melody of the piece. So it's this freedom that really encouraged me to write, to focus on composition.
Yeah, that I can hear that development in your playing, and of course, someone like George Duke, who you said was coming out of the jazz tradition, he's moving to Frank Zappa's band. I think Frank Zappa really bust him open, and then he comes back and has his incredible solo career. But you had the honor of being featured by Frank Zappa on one of the greatest early jazz rock albums of all time, which is obviously the album where you played his compositions. Can you tell us a little bit about what you remember about that album? Because what you're saying about, long form compositions, the music for violin and low budget orchestras is a very challenging piece and quite an incredible achievement for jazz violin in 69, 70.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, it's Richard Bach, the record producer, owner of that label I was signed to, World Pacific, who, after I had recorded Electric Connection and Live with George Duke, he suggested I do a collaboration with a rock or pop musician. And he mentioned Frank Zappa. I knew a bit of Zappa's music, and that was the most intriguing to me. I said, I don't know what can come out musically of such collaboration, but I'm open to the experience. And Zappa, therefore, Richard Bach played my music to Zappa. I didn't know him personally, but we got a meeting like at midnight, 2 days after Richard Bach suggested we do that project. And Zappa liked my playing immediately and accepted to arrange his music for a jazz instrumental album somehow. But I must say that that experience opened my mind, and because he was so daring, Frank Zappa, he didn't care about fitting in any. Oh, sorry. He didn't mind fitting in any category, music category, and that example was important to me because it. What is it? Are you okay? Sorry, you have so many things to
Oh,
do.
I won't. I'll leave it all in as long as we don't see any faces. They can. It's lovely to see what's going on. You're a very busy man, and it's lovely to see you giving your time over to chat to me. I'm very proud. So no problem whatsoever.
So when 2 weeks after we met Frank Zappa, we were in the studio. He was ready with his arrangements and orchestrations. And I felt at ease because the concept was really instrumental music. And I insisted to have George Duke with me because Frank was responsible for hiring the whole band and choose the musicians he wanted for the project. And so I said, okay, but I want George Duke with me. And so to have George, and also Zappa at the time was hiring musicians who were session musicians in Los Angeles who could play any style of music, but many were coming from the jazz world. They were jazz musicians. So there was an affinity from as soon as we started playing in the studio, I had no problem at all, except it still went beyond what I was doing at the time because Frank was very admirative of some classical modern composers, and so he wrote a piece for. He felt it was an opportunity to write a piece, a bit like a concerto for me. But since the label couldn't pay, I didn't have the budget to pay for a full orchestra. He just picked up the 3, 4 instruments like bassoon, I think.
It's wonderfully arranged because your violin features, but there's great big soloing sections, but there's also very beautiful, quite minimal counterpoint almost as you weave in with other instrumentalists, and it gives you that sort of a cinematic orchestral feel. But at the same time, he arranges it brilliantly for the musicians he had. It sounds a lot bigger than it actually is. In
Yeah,
my mind, there's an orchestra on it.
right. Yeah. So that was a step in my musical life where I understood that I could do the same and not care about writing music that would fit specifically in a jazz category or pop or whatever. Just let the inspiration come, and that's how I started doing it as well. So.
But those two albums, that and Hot Rats, which of course you were involved with, they're seminal albums. I mean, they're actually changing the nature of instrumental music, almost like busting it out of jazz, isn't it? Those are two albums, far more than, I mean, people go on about In a Silent Way and certain albums like that, but I feel they're the two key albums for me. And also establishing the violin as being a jazz rock instrument, which it does become. So it's an incredible achievement. What was Frank like as a person?
Well, he was with me. He was very nice. He was very respectful, and we had a good relationship. I felt he was really incredible as a composer, his ideas, yeah. And so I was impressed by his talent as a composer mostly. And but he could be very hard with the guys in his band, very hard. He could be very demanding.
But not to you.
Not to me, no.
No, you're too good.
Well, in fact, it's funny because when then he asked me to join the band to tour with the Mothers of Invention in '73. George Duke was on keyboards, and the rhythm section guys were had a jazz background as well. So when I would take a solo, I must say I was also I don't know. I don't know the term. I don't know what to say. But
Well, it's an incredible band, but I always felt that you were a little bit underused in Zappa's band when you joined the band. To have someone of your, stature or musical mind, I'm a big Zappa fan, and that's an incredible band. But I was a big fan of yours, and I'm a big fan of Zappa, so I would go and get these albums expecting to see you on there. And there's some incredible solos every now and then, but how much were you playing on those gigs? I mean, there's obviously quite complex parts, I suppose.
yeah, well, he was when he started his band with me, George Duke and Tom Fowler and Ralph Humphrey on drums. We all had the classical background. George Duke as well. He studied in a conservatory, and so we could really. Zappa was happy because I think it was the first band that could play his complex instrumental music inspired by classical composers. And so we could do that and read his music, but also play the blues and
Yeah.
the modern style of music. So at the beginning of the tour, the first month, we had a lot of instrumental pieces, and I had several solos. But the thing is, because the other guys in the band were also had a jazz background like me, when I would take a solo, they would follow me, and suddenly it would not be Zappa's band anymore.
Yeah, this is what I thought. Yes, you've explained it.
Leading the guys into the jazz world suddenly, and so after a while, it's funny because Zappa was recording every show, and we were listening in his room at the hotel one night, and he said, he didn't dare say it directly to me, but he said, there are some guys who take the music somewhere else. And so I got it, and I understood that in those days, when I was young like that, I did not really adapt to the other people's music. I just played what I felt and what my style was about at the time. with the years going on, lately, when I have done collaborations, I adapt more to the music and playing, you know. But in those days, that was the case. So also his audience was coming mostly for the satire, the lyric. And so I could feel myself that they were getting a bit lost with that much instrumental music. And so he started cutting down, and to a point where I only had one solo a night, and the rest of the time I would play background. So as much as I respected Frank's really being a genius as a composer, I wanted to do more with my violin than just that. So that's why I left the band.
Ah, that makes sense. Ralph Humphrey, he contacted me last year, and we had a lot of technical issues, and I interviewed him. A long interview. He went through his whole career and talked a lot about that band. And I didn't realize at the time he was actually terminally ill, and he died about 3 weeks after my interview. So I felt really it was an incredible thing to actually capture what he said. One of the things he said was with Zappa, Zappa never told you what he was trying to do. And so he said when he turned up to rehearsal and Chester Thompson was sat on drums, Frank never said, I'm going to get another drum and we'll have two drums. And so, was that also the case that Frank would just do and not necessarily go, Jean-Luc, I want to do this and this, we're going to use you like this? Was it just you were a tool of the composer?
Yeah. Well, anyway, that was a great experience. And again, what I learned mostly is how to be a good band leader, because he was definitely a strong band leader. And that's how I realized that it was important to know how to be a director, like a theater producer somehow. With comedians, you have to, the musicians, you have to make sure they understand the concept of the piece you want them to play. And he was very good at that, very strong. And that's what the example, because musically, I was already matured, and it was not really a musical influence on my music, my writing, but it's example as a band leader that opened my mind to how you had to do it to be successful.
Yeah, I can. There's it's you and George Dukes. There seems to be a big difference before Zappa and after Zappa, and there's actually you were both commercially successful. You sold records. And I think there's a shift. Is it true that you were asked by John McLaughlin to join the Mahavishnu Orchestra, the original version?
Yes.
So why did you not?
No, actually, he didn't contact me. He thought of me. I learned later from Billy Cobham that Billy and John had me in mind when they formed the first band. But because I was living in France at the time, and it was very complex to have me go to the States with immigration and musicians union and so forth, and plus they were really like starting without any money. They were like a garage band at first, so they didn't have the means to fly me from France. So they looked for someone in the States and found Jerry Goodman, and Jerry did a great job. I thought it was a great combination because
I think Jerry brought in the rock, not only playing wise but also visually. I first bought the Mahavishnu Orchestra album after I saw a picture of them as a very young guy, and I saw Jerry Goodman with the long hair, and I thought, oh, that looks good. So I think he had a great look, didn't he? But what influenced your move to the Mahavishnu Orchestra after Zappa's band? Did you not think of going into a solo career at that point? I know it happens quite soon, but what was your decision to join the second Mahavishnu Orchestra?
Well, when I left Zappa's band, indeed I had started writing. I had quite a few compositions in my drawers, and so I looked for a recording contract and started to record a demo of my music and sent it to Atlantic Records, and they were interested. So my goal was to start my own band. But then John called me, and John McLaughlin, and offered me to join the second version of the orchestra. And so it was a tough decision to make. What a choice, you know. But I said, okay, I accepted to do the Mahavishnu project, because then I felt more comfortable than with Zappa somehow, because I had more musical affinity with John McLaughlin, who John had also some, he was fan of some classical composers, but had a bit of a jazz experience. And the goal of the band on stage was really to play instrumental music. And him and me were the main soloists. So it was, I felt great to be with that band. Plus, also, I really loved John's composition, so original. And what he had created, it was really the sound. So finally I accepted, and it was a lot of fun. So it's funny, we were playing some duets. And with John, I learned he had so much energy that I had to get to that level, which was not my goal always to play like that, but with him, I had to. And it's funny that some nights he would say, "You won tonight." It felt like it was a duel somehow. But when I hear back the recordings we did, and with Jerry Goodman, indeed he was bringing something different to the band. This more classical rock concept, different from John and the rest of the band. Me and John were more similar in our concept of improvisation, but it was a lot of fun. However, I started to feel I really was urging to write my own music and develop my own concept. And with John, with Mahavishnu, the concept was only his compositions. So as much as I enjoyed playing with the band, I decided to start my own band. Finally.
Yeah. Well, I must confess that Visions of the Emerald Beyond is my favorite album of all time. It's such an incredible album. It's not just the playing and the compositions, it's the production. Ken Scott's incredible engineering on that album. Narada Michael Walden, my favorite drummer. The drum sounds incredible. What an incredible album. Would you say, you know, there's the legendary Pegasus track on there that was obviously you improvising based upon your approach. Was that really founded in the fact that you really just wanted to get out and have your own compositions? Because John McLaughlin, I'm such a fan of him, but he's brilliant in taking the personalities that are in his band and really bringing them in. And it's not, he doesn't just pull the instrumentalism. There's almost like a compositional aspect. I can hear your compositional approach in that. I can really hear Jan Hammer's compositional approach in the first Mahavishnu Orchestra. When you go and listen to Jan's composition, you go, well, they sound more like the Mahavishnu Orchestra than John's later compositions. So did you feel that, you know, you were putting a lot into it, and you felt you were ready to then put it into your own thing, or was it just truly annoying that that John had, you know, claimed composition of the whole album? Because it's quite a legendary event, isn't it? That you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, Mr. Ponty.
No, I can say that he was asking me to do one solo, I think violin solo, just by myself. I forgot if he was asking me to or if I did it.
Yeah.
But so in each concert, I would do this solo violin with effects. And when we recorded the album, we were in the studio. John said he asked me to do it on the album. And so at first I said, "Wow, this is me. This is my style. This is my piece." I'm not sure, but I was so happy to be in the band and play with him. I said, "Okay, yes." And so he just joined me and played a few notes on guitar behind me, this spacey mood. But this is really my piece, which there was a confusion, and I did not get credit for it. It was signed by John. So,
Well, all I could say is that at that moment you're like Jimi Hendrix of the violin. You can't even tell what's going on. It's an incredible piece of playing, and so in the end, it's great to have it on a record, isn't it? In the end, beautifully recorded. It's incredible. I was always fascinated because I wasn't even too sure whether it was violin. I just didn't know what it was when I was young. Incredible.
okay.
So when you strike out with on Atlantic Records, you make this run of absolutely classic albums, and it's at a time where jazz rock, this sort of classic era of jazz rock, sort of 75, 76, is falling away. The record companies are wanting everyone to sort of make disco records and maybe put a few vocals. What was Atlantic Records like? Because you stand your ground and not only make some of the greatest jazz rock albums of all time, but they are full on jazz rock. This is one of the things I've always loved about your career. You've never faltered. Right, there were all your 80s albums. You never fell into some of the traps that many other of your brilliant peers, Herbie Hancock, Stanley Clarke, but you seem to had a style, and it was almost. I'm a big progressive rock fan. There was an aspect of progressive rock in your approach, but there was also a beautiful melodic sense, which I think gave it a true commercial aspect. So, was Atlantic Records after that, or did they want you to have some vocal tracks and maybe a few disco beats here and there?
Yeah, what times they suggested indeed that I do some very well-known, a cover of a piece, or in fact, I remember one of the co-owners of the label, Ahmet,
Yeah,
because it's his brother who signed me, Nesuhi.
yeah.
Nesuhi was more dealing
He's
with
more the jazz guy, yeah.
and Ahmet with rock and R&B. So anyway, Ahmed said me and another artist, I think it was, I forgot who it was, but he said, he could never convince us to do something more commercial. We were doing only what we wanted to do. And, but since it was selling, it was successful, then they accepted, in the end. I was lucky to do that. But also it was a new kind of deal as being signed by, it was my production company that was signed. That was the idea of Mahavishnu's manager, Nathan Wise, who was a lawyer, and he was the first lawyer to choose to defend artists. Until then, it's only record companies who had lawyers. But he, and in fact, he had the Beatles as a client, as first client. So he was, famous attorney. And he loved the McLaughlin's music and decided to manage him. And but he was also getting deals for artists with record companies, and he was the one because I asked him to make my deal with Atlantic. He was the one to suggest that instead of signing as artists, where the record company can impose what they want on you, the concept was to sign as a production company. And therefore, we had the entire freedom of choosing everything, the studio, the engineer, the musicians, the music, the material, everything. So they had nothing to say, even though they tried. Yeah, they even tried with another label. It was Epic later on. They wanted me to do collaboration with a rapper. And I was not against rap. At the first, there were some talented guys when it all started. I saw the beginning of the emergence of that style of music. But I mean, again, it was not me. It was not my style. So I refused.
What I've just learnt talking to you now, it's filled in a few gaps because you look at John McLaughlin's experience with Tony Williams' Lifetime with absolutely no support and getting nowhere. And then when I think Miles introduced him to Nat Weiss, didn't he? And I think once he had decent management, it's almost like it does show that if you've got people behind the artists, the public will listen to better music, more challenging, music. And I think that's fascinating. And I say this all the time to my students. I said, make the music you want and try, because there are people there that want to listen to music. And I think your albums from then on are an incredible balance of that. It really seems to kick in around Aurora. Your compositions, I've got them all. I felt that upon the wings of music, you were still finding your feet compositionally. I hate to. I mean, I'm trying to give you my honest opinion, and I feel it comes together. But by Aurora, you have found a magical. It's very hard to describe what you got. It very accessible, but also very beautiful. And I mean, were you conscious of that journey towards that, or did you feel like you were searching for something and then you nailed it, or was it there right from the beginning?
No, but I agree with you. You're right, because Up on the Wings of Music was my very first album.
Phew. I want to give you my opinion because it's
Yeah, no,
interesting as someone who's into all this to actually
it's true. With hindsight, when I listen to my old album, it is true because, in fact, I had accumulated a lot of composition through the years, but was waiting to have a recording contract to read them. So it was not music I had written especially for that album, and recent compositions either. Somewhere going back 4 or 5 years before I could record them. So it's more of a patchwork of styles. Aurora was different, and Up on the Wings of Music, I recorded that album while I was with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So in between tours, we just went in the studio and did that album. Aurora, I already had developed more of my concept, and I wrote most of the music for the album, and so that's why it's more unified. It makes sense, yeah.
Being a drummer, I feel that you require a certain rhythm section. You had some incredible drummers throughout those albums, Casey Sherrill and Rayford Griffin, who was a big influence on me on your albums, an incredible player that had that sort of Billy Cobham's chops, but also could play in a very clean and compositional way. Whereas I felt Ndugu, he was one of my favourite drummers and brilliant with George Duke, but I felt that he wasn't quite right on that first album. That there was, it wasn't quite. I don't know what it is, but that's what I felt. That your rhythm section had to be a certain way to work, and that develops through those albums. I think it gets. I buy something like Mystical Adventures because that was the album for me. Rayford Griffin's drumming on that is just so beautiful, and it almost feels like minimalism, like Steve Reich, or it's a drum version of that. It's wonderful. Were they an influence, the sort of minimalist composers through that? Was that an extra thing because I hear that slowly coming in. You know, if you think um what oh God, I'm having a senior moment now. What's the album with Allan Holdsworth on not Cosmic Messenger,
Enigmatic
Enigmatic
Ocean.
Ocean? Yeah, those compositions are very opulent and big. And then after that, there's a sort of minimalism that comes in that I thought was wonderful, and not many jazz guys have explored it like you have.
It's true that after Enigmatic, I wanted to do something uh, less intense in the orchestrations, in the sound, in the speed, in the virtuosity, and all that. And that's why I did Cosmic Messenger. At the time, I was not aware of the minimalist. It's later on that someone, a friend of mine, who was fan of Steve Reich and Philip Glass, made me discover them. And I felt an affinity by instinct, and I love their music indeed. So, but I had that concept in my style to use loops and therefore repetitive, but also as mentioned earlier, the desire to go with simpler arrangements, lighter in the number of sounds and instruments.
Yeah, I
So
mean, and I think you know a lot of the jazz rock musicians of that time were trying to draw themselves in as they went into the 80s, and I think you did it probably around about the best anyone ever did it, and by individual choice, it's such a wonderful album. I'm a huge fan of Koyaanisqatsi, Scatzi, but I remember your video being played on the television with all the stop motion. It was incredible, and your violin playing, and it's just completely wonderful. Can I ask you a little bit about Allan Holdsworth, because you had a continuing relationship with him, and I felt that Alan's approach, his sound and tone, um, could be argued derived from you somewhat. I don't know if that's too much to say.
yeah,
Um, is that
no, we had a big affinity, and the reason is because, in fact, he started on violin, and I guess that's why he had this concept of very long sustained notes. And that was my feeling when I discovered his playing for the first time. It felt like an electric violin to me
yeah,
somehow. And since it's something I used in my compositions to have these long notes sustained. Uh, that's why I wanted to call him up and ask him to record on an album with me because of that affinity. And indeed, that's that's the link we had.
it's beautiful. And you did something that no one else has done in compositionally. Is you brought Alan in, but you also on the first album brought Daryl Stuermer in, who was much closer to being a sort of very attacking John McLaughlin-esque. And I think that's wonderful. You know, you don't expect another guitarist to be able to, you know, sit alongside Alan, but I think Daryl Stuermer does an incredible job, and it gives it a contrast, which
Yeah,
makes Alan even more great in the overall composition. This is why I brought composition at the front, because I've always felt you're a very great composer, and you think in those terms rather than just going, right, we've written ahead and we're in D minor, let's all blow for you know. And it has a sort of almost like progressive rock aspect, which must be your classical training coming through.
yes, definitely. Melody has always been important for me, but it's not a choice either. It's just spontaneous. It comes by instinct. Um, uh, in fact, Larry Coryell called me Mr. Melody as a nickname. Um, but I've always, okay, that's it. I've always been attracted by the emotion that has been created by beautiful melody. So uh, Chick Corea also told me that my music was, I had some, the rhythmic side of it was American, something I learned once I moved there. And, but it felt there was this European touch to the melodies and the harmonies.
Yeah, I mean, actually talking to you, I realize how much is there, and you've had a unique life in actually being able to pull on from so many different music forms, have so many different experiences, and work with so many key musicians. That's you know, because I can hear bebop vocabulary in there, modal jazz, electronica, ambient music, minimalism, the blues, Hendrix. There's a very wide palette, but you're very able to find ways of composing and having a line through. It's incredible, which I feel is lacking a little bit from modern jazz, modern instrumental music. I feel that people have forgotten about composition a little bit. You know, the Instagram and YouTube seems to get filled up with very virtuoso players, but I wonder where the composition is and where and the understanding of that voice existing inside, you know, and I wonder whether there's just not the training grounds anymore, you know, the Miles Davises and Frank Zappas and this to for young musicians to come up into. I mean, what do you feel about the contemporary instrumental music scene?
I'm not that much aware of it, although I'm listening to radio to try to discover new talents.
Mhm.
Some of them are, but it's rare. You're right that it's rare that I hear something that captures my emotions and moves me. It happens, but it's rare. Maybe more than before. Yes, I don't know. Uh, I I hear the young generation technically are incredible,
Mm,
uh, including classical music, in fact. But not always as creative. That's always the thing, you
yeah.
know. There are always throughout, and there will be in new generations very creative people, but maybe it's more rare than before. There is not as much to explore. Uh, so that's also a reason, and that's why they focus more on the technical perfection of what they do. But it could be a question of what the culture is
I
has.
think, I mean, I'm 56 years old, but even coming up in the sort of late 70s when I first started playing and then the 80s, there was that you couldn't just go and get the information. I can remember as a very young guy, I bought Crosswinds by Billy Cobham, and there was a track in 1716, but there was nobody to tell me that that was even a thing. I had to deal with that record to try and work out what was going on. I didn't know. I didn't even have any groundwork for it, you know. And I think that's the big difference. I think now, if somebody wants to know something, they can just Google it and they can find out exactly the scale or the rhythm, and they can get the, you know, the chart for it, and they can see exactly what's happening. But I found that I was having to fill the gaps in so much, and I think someone from your generation, apart from the classical training, which must have been strict, but from the jazz point of view, I find it astonishing that your generation was able to make that music when you were growing up, listening to Benny Goodman and Louis Armstrong and Stefan Grappelli. It's such a leap forward, and I've never understood it. I don't know what happened that you know. I mean, why did you not just end up sounding like Stuff Smith? I mean, what?
Well, I don't know, because again, I was very sensitive to the impressionists, the French impressionist composers like Debussy, Ravel, and later on Messiaen. I discovered Messiaen,
Mm,
um, and the harmonic concept, which was pretty advanced and very elaborate, and which I rarely heard in jazz, and of course not in the swing field. So that's why I was attracted. It was part of me, and when I would write music, I would like to go explore this type of harmonies. And the only type of jazz I could hear some of these harmonies was like John Coltrane, for instance, which is why it's then that I really started considering jazz as a very serious music, and I decided to abandon my classical career for jazz.
But one of my favorite classical compositions, if you can call it that, is by Messiaen, and it's scored for a choir, I think an Ons Martineau, which sounds like some weird spaceship synthesizer, and maybe percussion. And with this, he just weaves this otherworldly sound. It's absolutely incredible. I feel that as I talk to you, I can see that aspects in your music. You have an interest in that sort of almost. It's a sort of almost mystical, spiritual sound, isn't it? Messiaen's a very interesting composer, to mention. So it's been wonderful talking to you, Mr. Ponty. I've really enjoyed it. I think we've got to a point now where, we've come to the natural end of the conversation. Do you feel? I feel like I've got enough from you. Don't want to hold you anymore. And I hope you enjoyed some of those questions.
Well, I appreciate talking to you, because it's great to have. I can tell you have a deep understanding of music in general. You're yourself a musician, so it's always different for me to talk to someone who has that perception, that knowledge of music. So I enjoyed it, and thank you.
And I really hope I've got across, my respect and love of your music, and that I feel that what you have done musically, it's so great. There's so many different aspects which I think I just want to draw attention to. Change the sound of violin. You're a jazz rock pioneer. You brought all these influences in. You've found a way of selling records, and at certain points, a large number of records of music which is challenging and beautiful. And it's touched me for years and years and years, since I bought Mystical Adventures back in 1982 when I was 14 years old. And I bought it because I thought the cover looked great. I was into fantasy art, and I bought that album, and that changed my life, and it's given me a route, through, and a love of certain type of music. And I just want to say it's a wonderful thing to actually be, for my love of your music, to have brought me to actually be able to have a conversation with you about it, and I'm eternally grateful for that. So
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
thank you very much. So I hope where's my audience? I hope you enjoyed having Mr. Jean-Luc Ponty here, an absolute music legend. I know he doesn't want me to hear it, but I have to say it. I have to say it. It's one of my absolute favorite musicians of all time. So I thank you very much. I just want you to know I'm just sending you as much love as I can. That's all I'm doing. So
I appreciate it very much. It's heartwarming at my age. Thank you very much.
I think I've played music for 45 years now, and in the end, I think it's made out of love, and I think it's made out of respect and love, and the more you can remember that, you have a chance of making some decent music.
I'd like to hear your playing too. Send me some
I'll send you a few links.
Yeah.
I'll send you a few links to what I do. Yes, I'm not in your league, I'm afraid, but I don't think many people are. So.
I'm thinking about the fact that one of the great rewards for me is to receive messages from fans who say that my music has helped them go through difficult times in their life, the loss of someone, and I'm not the only one, the only musician who does that effect, but to be part of some musicians who can do that to people. And so you're right, music to me, the most important is it's like a metaphysical language. And
And it's not ours. And so you needn't, feel modest because in the end, it's not ours, is it? Everybody I know who makes music always feels like they're discovering something out there. They're just lucky enough every now and then to just open the window and it comes in. So it belongs to us all, doesn't it, in the end? I when I was 15 years old, I went through a very difficult time. I was really into my music and I was into the technique and I was studying my drumming. But when I heard the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Coltrane, when I heard Visions of the Emerald Beyond, your violin solos at the beginning of that, it expressed it expressed how I felt, which was at once. Coltrane does it as well. A torment and angst, but also an uplifting feeling
right,
of expressing that and being able to get beyond it.
yeah,
And I went right back to your early albums the other day, and you come in very young, absolute virtuoso, incredible playing, and then there's this by the time you're with Mahavishnu Orchestra, it's so chaotic at some points, and some of the live stuff I can really see you almost you're trying to create a different thing through that. I can try and see you centering the chaos sometimes, which is wonderful, and then your own thing moves them all the way back down to something which is very beautiful and ethereal, and all of that for me is of great value. And I feel I finally expressed how I feel about your music. So that's I'm finished now. That's it. I've got there.
I appreciate it. Great.
I hope,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Just yeah. So I'm going to stop now. So everybody, would you like to say bye to Mr. Ponty? Goodbye, and hopefully you've enjoyed this interview.